Hello, we're back for another week. This is the week of April 6th. Posting this video these screencasts a little later, um, just a little behind. So this week is a relatively straightforward week. You'll note, in addition to the screencast, there's an audio conversation between myself and Chuck Brown, who is an author of the two comics that you read for this week. So one way to think about this is really this was a week to try to think about exploring new visions in modern independent comics. At some level, last week we sort of delved into the kind of evolution around feminist narratives in comics, and the works for this week really give us an opportunity to think about this question of the comics canon from a perspective of waste. So we're looking at Bitterroot, Red Summer Special, and On the Stump. And as I said, one of the creators of both of these is a conversation is Chuck Brown, and I talked with him in relation to this. We were supposed to talk to him live in class this week, but that did not happen because pandemic. So we're still on track, and he was happy enough to sort of talk to me and talk about his work and talk about how the work came into being. In terms of framing, it's important to recognize that when we talk about comic studies as a field, there is traditionally a canon, right? And when you're in academia, you hear people talk about the canon. This is the work that is generally accepted by scholars and experts in the field as meaningful, and the features of the canon give the field its definition, its trends, its tropes. Like when you think about what sort of defines a kind of legitimate or artistic, academic understanding of the evolution of a field, the canon really sort of gives you a sense of like the work that has created that field, that landscape. So with comics, the real canon is actually a little bit divorced from what people actually read. And what I mean by that is there's no getting around this. When we talk about the comics people actually read, most people have actually read superhero comics, right? Comics that are attached to that juvenile narrative. But the comics canon is primarily defined, not completely defined, but highly defined by autobiography, trauma, and history. That is, autobiography would be, for us, those early comics that we read from people like Art Spiegelman. And Love and Rock is often sort of lumped in there as an autobiographical comic, right? Like it's the Hernandez brothers sort of like telling stories rooted in their experience as Latinx people in Los Angeles, right? Trauma, again, when you think about Art Spiegelman, Harvey Picard, we read, that was his autobiographical comic. Art Spiegelman did a comic that's both autobiographical and it's trauma, right? It's Mouse, which is one of the 3 comic books that every human being in the United States knows about, because that's one of the 3 comic books that's most commonly taught in school, right? But this is based on interviews that Art Spiegelman did with his parents about their experience in the Holocaust. In a similar way, Joe Sacco's Palestine really tells a story of history and trauma, of course, dealing with Palestine. And classic works that are from translation, like this is a French comic, Alan's War, which is an autobiography of American GI who fought in World War II. So in some ways, like when you look at these comics, they really sort of like tell the story of like a kind of classic comics canon. When we think about race in this context, though, often the comics that are really meaningful in terms of creativity and benchmarks in race are not necessarily part of the canon for a variety of reasons, right? You think about a comic like All Negro Comics, which was published in 1947, an anthology published by Orrin Evans, or Eben, which is a single issue comic that was created in 1970 by a guy named Larry Fuller, or even Butterfly, which is a comic created in 1971. These are independent comics produced not by major publishers, produced by creators. In the case of Butterfly, Those creators are not black, but these other two, All Negro Comics and Eben, are both African American creative teams that are creating these black characters, and they're doing so in a comic landscape where distribution of these characters is very difficult. All Negro Comics produced one issue, Eben produced one issue, and even Butterfly, which was in a comic anthology called The Hell Riders, was only in there for one issue. But these are really important comics. All Negro Comics is the first anthology ever produced by African Americans in the United States. It's unlikely, if you're not an academic, you would have ever heard of it. The same is true of Eben and the Butterfly. You would have never heard of those if you were not an academic or you're not, taking a class on comics like this one. So that really sort of like sets a kind of framework, right? On the one hand, there's a canon around legitimacy in comics in terms of literature and what people think about as serious comic stories. Most of that is very much graphic novels that were produced relatively recently in terms of the late, artists who were going to work in the late 60s and really starting to produce work, and that's sort of a serious, legitimate strand in the 70s and really sort of accelerating into the 80s. And that sort of sets up this sort of problem. And I'll come back and talk about that in part 2.